Okay, so we're going to get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us for our Monkey Business webinar series. We have today with us Helen Deverell from Helen Deverell Communications, and she's going to talk about how to audit your internal comms for future success. And just before I introduce Helen to all of you, we're going to have questions open throughout. So if you guys have questions, definitely type them in on the chat. We're also going to have questions at the end. So in case you don't get a chance to answer your question, feel free to pop in your question towards the end of the webinar. And so I'll just introduce Helen to all of you. Helen is an award-winning professional communicator with 11 years of experience as an independent internal communications professional. She's also the vice chair of CIPR Insight and an IOIC fellow. She regularly judges awards and at events and has a lot of experience with internal comms audits, writing skills workshops, and content strategy. So without further ado, Helen, I'm going to hand it on to you and we can get started.
Great. Thank you, Filza, and hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining this evening or this afternoon, wherever you are. As Filza said, today I'm going to be talking you through how to audit your internal communications for future success. So really want to start with the reasons why you might consider doing an audit in the first place. So there's lots of reasons why audits can be right for your organisation. And we know in our industry that we do have a bit of an issue around meaningful measurement, and a lot of organisations aren't measuring their communications, internal communications, don't really necessarily have a sense of how effective they are, if they're actually having an impact, the impact that was desired in the first place. So audits can be a great way to really get a baseline of how things are working in your organisation if you're not currently doing any types of measurement or meaningful measurement. And by that I mean gathering outcomes rather than just outputs. So by doing an audit, you get that baseline. It makes it much easier to then set smart objectives, which you can then can inform your internal communications, and then you'll be able to measure in future how far you've come, because you've then created that baseline to measure back to. Another reason might be that you're new into a senior internal comms role within a new organisation, and you want to understand the organisation better and how internal comms is currently working within it. So an audit can be a really good way of understanding that and getting to grips with the new organisation. It might be that you're writing a new strategy, or you have strategic decisions that you need to make, and by doing an audit can give you the sort of valuable information you need to inform some of those decisions, make sure that it's founded in really good research and understanding of your organisation. So lots of different reasons why you can do audits, and some people do them fairly regularly as well. So some people will do them once a year or every 6 months, so much smaller audits, and sort of check in and make sure that things are constantly moving in the right direction. But whatever your reason for doing an audit, it's really important that upfront you're really clear on why you're doing it. So you have clarity on that purpose and what you're looking to achieve out the other end of it, just to make sure that when you then come to plan the audit, that you're very clear on what that scope is, and you ensure that everything that you do as part of it, which we'll talk about through this webinar, does ensure you get the outcomes that you're looking for. So I think we're now going to go to a quick poll before we carry on.
Yes, so I'm just going to launch this poll. I'd love to hear from all of you. I'd love to hear from all of you if you've ever done an internal comms audit. Interested to know if some people have never conducted an audit before but are considering it, or if some people have just never even thought about it in the first place. I can see people are still answering. And so very interesting mix of answers. So 30% of people have said yes, that they have conducted an audit, while 22% have said that they haven't, and 48% haven't, but the good news is that they are considering conducting an internal comms audit.
Brilliant. That's really good to see.
Okay, so we'll probably move on to the next slide.
Okay.
And so Helen, I'm going to hand it over to you again.
Thank you. Okay, so once you've got that clarity on why you're doing the audit in the first place, what you're wanting to achieve as part of it, there's a few other things you need to think through before you start. So thinking through obviously your budget and the scope that you want this audit to cover. So often it's quite a good idea, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment as well, but to get in external help, so an agency or an external consultant, mainly because they can help you bring that anonymity, they can bring objectivity, and they also bring a wealth of experience and so on. But obviously with that comes budget and making sure, and not just from the point of view of bringing someone in, but also what they are then doing while they're there. So audits can be very scalable. You can do them on a huge scale, depending on the size of your organisation, what you want to achieve, or you can do them much smaller as well, which is why it's really important before you go too far, you do understand what budget you have to give to this, what the scope might look like, so that you can have really informed conversations with those third parties if you choose to bring them in, about how that might work in practice and what's realistic within the budget that you have. You don't want to sort of end up with scope creep later on and ending up having to pay out money that you haven't budgeted for, or have to choose between that or missing out on potentially really valuable information. So being really clear up front. As I said, who should conduct that audit? That anonymity, that independent, and being able to provide anonymity can be really useful for an audit if you want to get really open, honest answers from people, to really get to the crux of any issues that are going on. People are probably more likely to be open and honest with external help. So depending on your situation and the budget, that can be a good idea. It can be possible to do it in-house as well. I know people that have done that, and especially if you're quite new to the organisation and you haven't yet built those relationships and you don't have any particular bias, you're sort of not tied into any of the channels or any of the programs or projects that have been delivered. If you can keep that objectivity, then often it can be done by people that are new to the organisation as well. So that is another option. It's also really important to think about when to audit. So thinking about what else is going on in your organisation. If you're asking people to give up time to do focus groups and surveys, interviews, it needs to be at times that's not their busiest time of the year or during school holidays, things like that, when people are likely to be away and taking time off. So you want to find a time of the year that is suitable for your organisation, not just suitable for you as a team, to make sure you get the biggest uptake and get people really involved and engaged with it. So a few other things to consider as well. It sounds obvious, but if you're going to do an audit, you do need to be prepared to listen to the feedback and act on that feedback. Sometimes that can mean listening to some quite hard truths. I've heard of organisations that have done audits or engagement surveys or any type of measurement, and then the results haven't been quite what they were hoping for. And as a result, they've then not done anything with that. And that is the quickest way to lose trust of your employees. If they're giving up their time to share their thoughts and experiences with you, then they need to feel that they are being heard and that something will happen from it. So be really clear, not just from you as an internal comms team, but also that your key stakeholders, your leaders, are also prepared to not only listen, but to act on any feedback you get. Otherwise, it is a bit of a pointless exercise and you will lose trust. And that does mean leaving egos at the door. So keeping in mind that the feedback is not personal. You don't need to take it personally. It's actually about an opportunity to improve. In audits, you do get a lot of challenges and issues come up, but people do also give positive feedback as well. So there will be positive elements, and there will also be opportunities to improve. So it's something to not take personally when there is negative feedback, and that can help you be a bit more objective about how you then move forward with some of the findings. So when you decide to do an audit, obviously make sure that you communicate it clearly. So what I mean by that is not just asking people to take part in a survey or to take part in an interview or a focus group, but giving them the wider context of why you're doing this audit in the first place, what you're hoping to achieve, how their thoughts and experiences are really going to help you shape your approach to communication and how that supports the organisation. The more people understand that and buy into that, then the more engaged they're going to be and the more willing they're going to be to share their experiences and to be open and honest with you. I always think that you should, where possible, offer anonymity to people. As I said before, that's where people really do or can be honest and open, and it's where you get the best insight. If people feel that there might be any type of comeback on that, or they might be able to be identified, they're probably not going to give you the most honest feedback. And that's what you really want. If you really do want to make positive change and to really make a difference in the way that you're communicating, then you do need to hear that honest feedback. And that's where having a third party can be really useful, because they will be able to keep that anonymity and people will be able to trust that that is the case. There's something as well around keeping objectivity when choosing participants. So obviously, even if it's being conducted by an external agency or consultant, you will have some sort of say in you'll be guiding them as to who to speak to, who to do interviews with, who to put into the focus groups. You can do different ways with that. You can do a sort of a call out for people to come forward, but you may want to be targeting certain areas of the business. Again, that comes back to your why. Why are you doing it? What are you trying to achieve? But if you are being quite targeted and there are key bits of information you want to get, just try to be really objective when choosing participants. Don't sort of always go to the people you have relationships with or people you know that are quite positive about internal comms all the time. Try to get that mix and try and get people that you don't necessarily hear from all the time, and people that you're not sure what they'll say, just to make sure that you do get that mix and your internal bias isn't kicking in and sort of steering you towards people that you know will probably have something positive to say. And it may be that everyone has something positive to say, but you need to make sure that you give people have the opportunity to hear different views and opinions. And following on as well from making sure that you are listening and acting on feedback, it's one thing sharing the feedback, but it's also really useful to make sure you share what the next steps are going to be. So hold yourselves accountable, make it really clear to people that, okay, we've listened and this is now what we're going to do as a result of that, and make it really tangible for people, ideally when it will happen, what's going to happen, who will it involve, and help people see that action really is being taken as a result of what they've told you.
So I think it's very key to be very clear in your communications throughout with everyone involved in the whole process.
Absolutely, yes, completely. It's always making sure people have that sense of why it's happening and have that wider context. So thought we'd run through what an audit actually looks like in practice. So as I mentioned before, it can be very scalable. So it might be that this list here, which I'll run through, you might take elements of it, you might do the full thing. There might be bits that an external party does and parts you do to keep costs down. So you can do what's right for your organisation, which again comes back to being clear on what you're trying to achieve. It helps you then understand what you need to do and how you can get the information you're looking for. So if you are working with an external party, I think the first step, and often forgotten step, is a really comprehensive brief, not just jumping into the audit itself, but really creating clarity on that why, what you're trying to achieve, what's in scope, what elements of the audit you want, what can be done on site, what can be done remotely, what the budget is, all that sort of stuff that really helps that external person or agency get a really good picture of what needs to be done, how it's going to be done. So that brief is really key, and also to make sure that everyone has clarity on what the scope is as well, so that there is no scope creep and you get what you're expecting and they deliver what you're expecting, so that everyone's clear on that. It's really important early on to engage your stakeholders and ideally leaders as part of that. So audits, well, they're a great measurement tool, but they're also a really great way to demonstrate how strategic internal comms can be. So the very fact that you're doing an audit and you're taking measurement very seriously and you're measuring outcomes, and you'll be able to say to leaders and stakeholders that actually any future decisions we make or the strategy we're creating is based on sound evidence that we've got from our organisation. We've listened to our people, we've got the measures. That's actually really, really powerful to be able to say that to them. So the actual audit itself is also a really great way to demonstrate how strategic you're thinking. As well as actually getting the measurement as well. And of course, you also want your stakeholders and your leaders to promote the audit and to give it their backing and encourage people to take part. So to really show that they're on board and to encourage people to get involved. That's quite key. Depending on if you have got a third party involved, scoping session can be a really good idea, just around the table to really understand your organisation. If you've got an organisation that's sort of structured in a more complicated way, or it's global, or there's lots of things to consider, it can be quite useful to have a scoping session to really help that third party understand it all, understand your organisation, and then put together a proposal for the best way to approach it. So that can be quite a useful exercise.
Helen, we have a question from Mike. He's asking, does a good audit require all of these elements? What would you say to that?
I think in an ideal world, you would do all these elements in a full service audit, but I have done audits for charities and smaller clients where there hasn't been the budget, and we've scaled it down, and it's been quite effective. So for example, for some clients, I've done it all remotely. So I've done interviews remotely and done desk research and a survey. So I didn't necessarily run focus groups for them. I didn't do anything face-to-face. I didn't go to their premises, but I was still able to get a good picture because there was a clear brief and a clear scope. It really does depend on your organisation, what you're trying to get out of it. I think if you can get as much input as possible from interview surveys, focus groups, that's great. But I don't think you need to look at this list and think, oh gosh, I could never afford that. We don't have the budget for that. Actually, it can be quite achievable if you think of it smartly about it and take the elements that are going to give you the most meaningful information.
Okay.
So then, as you can see, then there's the sort of key components to the audit. So desk research, by that I mean any information that's already existing. So whether you've got strategies, you've got your channels, so your intranet, anything else, magazines, anything, emails that you're using to communicate. Sometimes it might involve actually doing a site tour as well, so actually seeing the environment that your employees are working in, seeing if there's screens around the building, posters, all the different ways they might be receiving and sharing information. Desk research helps you to sort of create that picture. Interviews, they can be done on the phone or face-to-face. Obviously face-to-face is always a great option. You can read body language, it's a bit more personal, but phone can work very well as well. And by doing one-to-one interviews, it gives you that opportunity to delve into things a little bit more than when you're doing focus groups, for example. So you can sort of get a bit of a deeper conversation. Surveys, where possible, you're obviously not going to be able to speak to everyone in an organisation or in the part of the organisation you're targeting. That's just not realistic. So survey can be a great way to capture as many people as possible, feel like they're having an opportunity to share their voice, and it can be a great way to hear and to corroborate as well everything else that you're hearing in the organisation. So surveys can be really great for that. Ideally a mix of questions with multiple choice and also comment questions as well, so you are still getting some of that qualitative data.
Speaking of surveys, Helen, we have another question from Stephanie, who's asking if there's a sample survey that you could possibly share. If you have an example of one, maybe we can email it to people after the webinar.
So sample questions.
So Stephanie, if you can clarify, do you mean like sample questions, or what exactly did you mean? So she's saying sample questions.
Okay, yeah, I can certainly share some sample questions that I've used. That's not a problem, I can do that.
Yeah, so after the webinar, we are going to email some links and whatever has come up during this discussion to all of you, so you'll have access to everything.
Great. Then focus groups. So just so you know as well, I'm going to delve into interview surveys and focus groups in a bit more detail in a minute as well, and provide a bit more information about how to run them. But focus groups, they're another good element of an audit because it's a slightly different way of getting information. You're getting a group of people together, ideally a mix of people from different roles and levels. And it's a chance to have people talk in a room, but they tend to bounce off each other, and what one person says might spark an idea or a thought in someone else. So you do tend to get a different type of information, different type of experience with that. So it's another way to get good information, and it's quite a good temperature gauge as to if someone says something, if the rest of the room agrees, you know that's probably is quite an issue, or whether it might be an isolated issue in a certain part of the business. So it's quite helpful to have that gauge as well. And then, and again, I'll run through this more, but that's what you then do the analysis part of the audit, where you bring together all your findings and analyse, looking for trends and themes that are occurring across all of them. So really starting to look for things that might actually be an issue or a challenge that does need to be addressed. And then from that, you can start to make recommendations to address those things. So, and again, that can be useful to have that third party, because they can bring in recommendations from having done it in other organisations, their experience, working with other clients, and so on. So that can be quite useful. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. But that can be quite that good element that they bring. So, don't think it's moving.
Yeah, just try.
I'll move on to talk about the next slide while we're waiting for it to load. So I was going to then move on to talk to you a bit about actually running surveys and top tips for doing that. So if you are thinking of running a survey as part of your audit, there's lots of different survey tools that you can use. Again, I can send a list at the end of the audit. That's not a problem. And they're usually a lot of them are free, and you might have to pay a bit to get some of the analytics at the end, but there are some good free tools out there. Oh, there we go. But yeah, so there's some good basic good guidance for when you're running a survey. So it sounds obvious, but asking one question at a time. Always double check that you're not actually asking two things within a question. It's easy to slip into that. It just makes it very difficult when you get the answers to know what the individuals were actually answering. It's a mistake I've seen several times. So then it just skews your results a little bit, as you're not really getting a sense of were they saying yes to that first part of the question or the second part or both of it. So it can get a bit confusing. Using a Likert scale can be a good way of measuring opinion and perception. So asking people how much they agree or disagree on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 7. So gives you quite a good quantitative measure, and that they use quite commonly in surveys to get a sense of how. So for example, you might say how on a scale of 1 to 5, how useful do you find the internet, and then you would get a real sense of that on a number basis of how people are finding that. So quite a crude measure, but quite useful. You can use logic within the survey tools that you use. So if you have several audiences that you want to target, you don't have to do multiple surveys. You can actually use the logic to ensure that certain people see certain questions. So for example, if someone says they're a people manager, you might want to ask people managers an extra question, so only people that tick people managers would then see that question. So you can be quite clever with how you do the survey. Another error that I see quite a lot is ambiguity around some of the terminology that's used. So be really clear on what people understand things to mean. So if you say manager or leader, be really clear. So if you say leader, are you talking about the CEO? Are you talking about the leader in people's departments? Who do people see as their leader or as their manager? So when you get the feedback, you can have clarity on what people were actually answering. So if there isn't that agreement within your organisation on what some of those terminology means, just make it really clear in your question who you're referring to or what you're referring to, so that when you get the results, there isn't any ambiguity about what people have said.
Helen, we have a question from Cindy. She's asking if for a survey, is it more effective to have open-ended questions or multiple choice? How do you analyze open-ended questions? So what is your suggestion?
Yeah, I always like surveys that have a bit of a mix. So if you have some closed questions, you do just get much quicker results, and it's much easier to sort of do some of that analysis. But I always think, especially if it is a smaller audit and it's one of the key ways you're getting some of that extra information, I think giving the option for comments is really important. you would analyse it in the same way that you analyse interview or focus group out feedback. So it is a case of reading through the comments, looking for trends, looking for themes. So it takes a bit more time. So I would limit the amount of comment options you give. Don't put them on every question. It will take you an awful long time to go through it, but pick a few key ones. So for example, on the last bullet point, anything else you want to share, I always try and ask that at the end of a survey as an open comment box question. It's so simple. You'd be surprised about what sometimes comes up if you haven't already asked something. It might be that it's something very specific to a part of the business and you haven't thought to ask a question about it, but actually it's really key to the findings in your audit. So just giving people that option to share anything else and do it in a comment box option, that can give you some really useful information. But yeah, I would say surveys need to be a mix, and it is a case of, if with those open comments, making sure that you allow enough time when you're doing the analysis to actually read through all the comments. So if you know you're going to have thousands of responses, then be realistic about how many comment boxes you're going to have and what resource and capacity you have to analyse that. Okay, so we'll move on to top tips of focus groups.
I think the slides are just taking a little bit of time with this software to load, so
that's okay.
Continue, and then I think it's gonna automatically move on.
Great. So I'll carry on until the slide appears. So focus groups. Oh, actually, no, I don't think focus groups are next, is it? It might be interviews, actually.
I think it's interviews.
It's interviews, okay. So so yes, if you're doing one-to-one interviews, whether face-to-face or over the phone, there's a few key things to bear in mind. I always like to say to people to remember that it's a conversation, not an interrogation. I think it's always important to put yourself in the shoes of the other person. You might do interviews all the time as part of your job as an internal communicator, but actually someone being asked to take part in an interview, that can be quite a daunting experience and daunting thought. And they might be worried about having questions fired at them, and you certainly don't want it to be that kind of firing of questions, interrogation. You want it to position it more as a chat, more as a conversation. And although you'll have a list of questions that you're probably working through, you can still do that within a conversational way, and people will open up more and feel more at ease. So thinking about using icebreakers and context. So if you're interviewing face-to-face, for example, it can sometimes break the ice just by going to find a nice, comfortable place to sit, making sure they have a tea or a coffee, making sure you don't jump straight into the interview. So ask them how their weekend was, ask them how their day's going, and just get them used to chatting and realise actually this is a relaxed environment where it doesn't have to be interrogation style at all. And also what can often put people at ease is reminding them of why you're doing this interview in the first place, the wider context of it, and also how it's going to work. So explain to them you have a list of questions, but it is going to be more of a conversation, that you might follow up on things they say, and remind them what will happen with it at the end, so they feel confident that their response is going to be treated anonymously. So always remind them that anything they say will be kept in confidence. And then what will happen with that information at the end, just so they feel really confident they can speak openly. So asking open questions, making sure that you ask questions that don't just require a yes or a no. So again, creating that more conversational and richer answers. So that could be questions like, tell me more about, or how confident are you about? So it might be, how confident are you that you understand the strategy? Or in your own words, could you describe? Or how did that make you feel? There's lots of different open questions you can ask to elicit more meaningful responses from people. Asking follow-up questions. So I think there could be a temptation sometimes if you've written questions, especially if they've been signed off by someone, that you have to stick to them. And while you should obviously go through your questions, if someone says something interesting, then follow it up. It could be really useful for the audit. And, as communicators, we are curious, and that is how we go and find stories. So if someone does say something that you think, actually, I should know more about that, I want to know more about that, then don't be afraid to follow up on it and to ask additional questions, and then come back to your structured ones after. I think it's really important to listen and empathise, and by that I mean really listen, not be thinking in your head about the next question you're going to ask or looking at your notes. You look people in the eye, have open body language, nod when people are speaking. And obviously you can't always do that on the phone, obviously, but you can still make the reassuring noises and show that you're listening and answer in the right places. And you can also, again, follow-up questions help to show that you have been listening very clearly to them. So people need to feel that you are genuinely interested in what they're saying, and also that you've got empathy. I've been in interviews and focus groups where people have got really emotional, and it's ultimately where they spend most of their days, and they're telling you something that's actually quite upsetting for them or quite emotional for them. They need to feel that the person they're telling actually, it's not about saying whether or not you agree with what they're saying, but it's just about showing that you care, that they're sharing that with you, and that you'll treat it with the respect that it deserves. So that's really important if you want people to be open and honest with you. Again, that anything else you want to share question, it's really powerful in interviews and focus groups. You'd be amazed at what people tell you when you ask that question. People will often assume they can only tell you what you ask them. So if you haven't asked a specific question, they'll assume it's not within the remit of the interview and won't bring it up. So it's so important you ask that question, and then you'll be surprised at I've sometimes found the most important elements have come out by asking that question. So it's really key that you always remember to ask that. And as before, outline the next steps. So just remind them what's going to happen after that, just to conclude the interview and make sure that they go away feeling confident with how that will play out. So now we'll move on to focus groups. So focus groups, as I said, they're a great way to get information, and get information from multiple people at one time as well. So especially if you do have a tight budget or tight resource, getting multiple people in a room can be a really great way to get a lot of information in quite a quick way. So ideally about 10 to 12 people. You don't really want to go much above that, because it'll be too difficult for everyone to be able to speak. You want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to share their voice, and much more than that, it's difficult to get through all your questions and give everyone a chance to speak. And much below that, it starts to feel a little exposing. You don't get as much bouncing around the room with the ideas and thoughts. So 10 to 12 is sort of the sweet spot for focus groups. And again, it's about having that sort of conversational aspect. It's not about firing questions and going around the room. It is putting a question out to the group and then allowing them to discuss and share and chat amongst themselves. You want to be able to facilitate that conversation, but you don't need to be sort of firing questions or calling on individuals. Allow them to take that conversation, and then you help guide that to where you need to go and when you need to move on to the next question. Ideally, you want to avoid having their managers or the internal comms team in the room. A lot of people do ask if they can sit in, but ideally you want to say no, because people, again, they just won't speak as openly and honestly if they feel like they're being listened into by someone that's got a vested interest really in what they're saying. So it's important that there is, as much as possible, you provide that anonymity and allow them to speak freely. So and try to, although have a mix in the room, just make sure that mix isn't going to make people feel uncomfortable if there are particularly senior people there. So I think it's really important to set expectations up front with the rooms when you're starting the focus group, reminding everyone that it's about listening respectfully and not judging what other people say, so that people can, you don't have to agree with people in the room, just be really respectful of what your colleagues are saying. Reminding people you do have limited time, so it's important to be conscious of not speaking for too long, letting other people have an opportunity to speak. It's not about justifying or finding solutions. People often want to, if someone raises an issue, someone else wants to jump in and say, well, that was because. But really what this is about is just sharing experiences and issues. It's not about finding solutions at that stage. You can easily go off down another path and spend a long time talking about things that actually aren't going to get you the information you need. And again, remind them, everyone in the room, that everything will remain anonymous, which not only means you keeping that anonymity, but trusting them that they will also keep the anonymity of the room as well. So they're not going to go talking about what other people have said in the room. So asking them to keep that trust and anonymity as well. As a facilitator, it's your job to keep that conversation going, to make sure it stays on track and to time. And also about spotting people who are struggling to speak. There will always be some people that tend to dominate a room, and it's not out of rudeness, it's usually a passion and excitedness and wanting to share their thoughts and ideas. But just keeping an eye on people that are a bit quieter, that might want to speak. You may need to now and again call on people and say, did you have something you wanted to add? And just being conscious of that. It can be really useful to record the session as well. I just have a little dictaphone that I use to record, and it just means that you can worry less about writing notes and again be more present in the room, make sure that facilitation is going well, doing all the listening and empathizing that I talked about before, looking people in the eye, having the open body language, and really listening to what people have got to say. And as before, outlining the next steps again, so reminding people before they leave that their input has been really valued, how it's going to shape what's happening next, and when they'll hear back. I often get asked, before I even get to that point, when are we going to hear the outcome of this? So people genuinely want to know they're going to see something come out the other end of it. So I think we're going to go to another poll now.
Yeah, so I'd love to know for your internal comms, if you guys prefer doing interviews, focus groups, or a combination of surveys, interviews, and focus groups. I'd love to hear what everyone has to say, what's been most effective, not just for audits, but in just to gauge, your internal communications in general. What have all of you found most helpful? So if you can answer the questions in the comments, that would be great, because I think our poll is not working properly at the moment for this one. We'd love to hear in the chat which method have you guys found most useful, or if there's something else that you may have used that's not here that has been very helpful in gauging the impact of your internal communication. So I think some people have started answering. Surveys have been useful. A combination of everything has been helpful to some other people. I would assume that a combination of all three would probably give you the most significant results in terms of your internal comms. Interesting to know that focus groups have also been helpful. Yeah, and I think Mike is saying interviews cover a lot of ground. And I think that is true when you're dealing with employees from all over the world. A lot of companies have employees that are scattered in different areas. So that would be helpful.
Definitely. I think with interviewees as well, it's really important if you are covering a large geographical area, or you just have a lot of employees in one place, trying to really think through who might be really key people to interview that might be able to bring in a lot of input from or reflect the views of multiple people as well. So there might be people that have worked in different roles throughout the organisation, so they would be really key to talk to, because they would have multiple experiences, can look at things from different perspectives. So it's always thinking through who would be able to really give you a much richer view, might be able to represent the views of others, and so on. So I think Mike's absolutely right. When you're trying to get across a geographical spread of employees, interviews can be a great way of gathering views that sort of maybe represent the views of a wider audience, but surveys can help with that as well.
Definitely. I think it also depends on the type of project that's being done. So in certain cases, focus groups might be more useful. In other cases, just simply running a survey may be enough to get the results that you're looking for.
Absolutely, and that goes back again to the beginning of that why you're doing it is so important, and then being clear on what will help you achieve that. So you don't necessarily need to do a full service audit. It might be that focus groups and a survey will be sufficient. It really does depend on your organisation and what you're trying to achieve. Yeah,
definitely. So I think we'll move on to the next slide, and if people have more to add to the conversation, that works as well.
Okay.
So I think it's taking a bit of time to,
Sure.
Yeah, so if we can just.
Okay, that's fine. I'll carry on. So next, I was going to talk a bit about analysing the findings and what you need to think about when you've gathered all your information, you've done all your surveys and focus groups and so on, and you've got it all there. And what you're really looking to do is looking for common trends and themes. You're not looking for individual comments or looking to attribute individual comments to individual people. It really is about, and you will see them if you conduct an audit, lots of things will come up time and time again. They might have slight nuances on them depending on what part of the organisation those people are in. But ultimately, that you will see trends. So for example, I often see trends across multiple organizations around people managers. That's often an issue for a lot of people. The relevance of content. So sometimes there can be, there isn't segmentation around channels or the content. So people end up receiving things that aren't relevant to them. The effectiveness of channels, lack of employee voice, sometimes even the lack of an internal comm strategy. A lot of teams, and we've seen that in some of the research that's been done over recent years, is that still a lot of internal comms teams don't have strategies, and that can be, and you can find then via the audit that actually the impact that's really having and isn't allowing comms to be as targeted or as strategic as they would like. So you will spot themes that come up again and again. When you're doing analysis as well, you want to start looking to join the dots. So you may hear things from employees that don't quite make sense, and it's not that you don't believe them, but you just can't work out why that would be. And then pulling it all together can help create that picture. So it might be that you then find in the desk research something that makes sense. So whether it's people saying they're not receiving certain messages, and then finding out that one of the reasons is they haven't got access to a particular channel, or whatever it might be, you can start to join the dots and realize that there will be causes, and you can only really start to get the sense of that when you've got that full picture, which you will have when you've done all your data, you've collated all your data, you've done all your interviews and your surveys. You can then start to recognize why certain things might be happening and start to spot the correlation between them. As I mentioned before, when you're doing the analysis, survey tools can do a lot of that analysis for you. So do use them, use some of the tools that they have in the analysis section to really start pulling out where there might be trends and themes within particular audiences and parts of the business, and where there might be very specific issues around that. You can cut the data in all sorts of different ways. And again, if you're clear on what you're trying to achieve, you can then cut it in ways that will help you see and get that picture. So that can be quite useful. I often use SWOT analysis as well, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you can do that in a quadrant. And just by taking your findings and putting them into those 4 quadrants, that can be really useful to think through what you found and understand what is the strength, what is the weaknesses, where you have opportunities. And your opportunities box will hopefully be nice and long, full of opportunities that you can take forward. And then also threats as well. So the threats of not making these changes, the things you've uncovered that are threatening to the internal comms team, or even sometimes to the reputation of the organisation. So to really get a sense of sometimes the seriousness of some of the things you uncover and why they need to be addressed quite quickly or made a priority. So that can be a really good way of understanding the findings and helping to put a little bit of order behind them and how you might approach them. Sometimes internal comms teams will be very open that they don't really know who their audiences are, but sometimes they might think they do, and you'll uncover other audiences they weren't aware of. And that's the great thing about an audit and being independent, is through the conversations you have and the surveys and so on, you might identify audiences that actually are being included as part of a broader audience, but actually they need to be pulled out and treated on their own because they've got very specific needs and things like that. So this could be a really great way to spot those people that need that little bit more attention or targeted communications and hadn't previously been recognised as such. As part of the analysis as well, you might be able to identify shadow comms, so communications that employees, channels that employees might be using that the internal comms team aren't aware of. So at the moment, WhatsApp is coming up time and time again. Lots of employers are using it actually to conduct work and to communicate with colleagues, not just socially, but actually on a work basis as well. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's great to understand what's happening, understand how, if it is working well, if there's a way that internal comms can utilise that as well, especially if employees are using that as their preferred channel. And there are other types of shadow comms that might be going on. So it's useful that the audit may shine a light on some of those things and help the internal comms team either add them to the channel mix or understand what the reason was. So sometimes employees create channels because the need that they have isn't being met by the comms team or the channels that exist. So it might be that that's the point that you need to address rather than the actual channel shadow comms they're using themselves. So it can help you understand a bit more about that as well. So when you're then doing your recommendations, you can structure the recommendations in a number of ways. So I often like to do it as quick wins, medium-term priorities, and long-term priorities. So usually audit reports, especially if you're doing a full service audit, they can be really hefty documents. They can be, 50 or more pages long. So there's an awful lot of information for people to take on board. So breaking the recommendations down into things that can have an impact and are quite easy to do and have an impact really quickly, that can be really useful to prioritize as quick wins, medium term and then long term, just so people get a sense of what they need to prioritize and not feel like they have to do everything at once. It can be quite a good way to help people digest and understand what needs to happen next. You can also consider structuring it around the SWOT analysis. That's another way to structure it, especially if you are using that approach in your analysis. You can use it also in your recommendations. But I also keep in mind when you're doing your recommendations, especially if you are external and you're doing it for an internal client, making sure that you're being realistic with what you're offering. It may be that in an ideal world, your client needs a very witty social collaboration tool, but actually they don't have the budget or the resource to manage it. So it's about being really realistic on what you recommend them to do, finding options that will suit their budget, their audience as well. Not everything will suit the types of audiences, but being really realistic on resource and budget and not suggesting things that they can't possibly deliver, and you'll lose credibility very quickly if you do that. So what should the final report look like? So I always start with an executive summary where I summarise the key themes and trends that came out and then some of my key recommendations. So I find that if you're sharing it with leadership or stakeholders, whoever it might be, they're often not going to have time to read the whole report, but it's quite useful for them to have that executive summary up front. I usually do about an A4 page, which just summarises the report. I always include the brief and scope again, including things that weren't included, so being really clear on your exclusions as well, just as a reminder for everyone to make sure that everyone's clear on what the expectation was and what's been delivered. Reminding people of the methodology, so whether it was surveys, focus groups, desk research, so on, just so again there's for someone that's looking at this report that wasn't necessarily involved in the shaping of it, they have a sense of how you came to these conclusions. Then I detail all my key themes. I try and break them down into sections where things fit quite well together. So you might have a section on strategy, you might have a section on channels, so on. So to make it again a little bit more digestible. Then you'd have your SWOT analysis. Sometimes you might have a section in your report for indirect issues. So you'll often uncover things in your audit that internal comms can't control or can't change, but they are impacted by. So it might be that it's a HR issue, a culture issue. But actually it does need to be addressed and it comes up again and it's quite a prominent theme, but it's not something that's within the remit of internal comms. So I always flag these things and suggest that the internal comms team speak to the relevant departments and collaborate to find a solution to that. But those things are really key, and also key to make it clear to the internal comms team that it's not their job to fix it, but that they do need to flag it and it is impacting their ability to communicate effectively. Then you'd have your recommendations. And then you'd move on to have appendices. So I tend to have in my appendices, I might have the questions I asked, I might have a list of the desk research materials I looked through and so on. Again, just providing that context for someone who might be coming to it fresh and want to have some of that context. And then finally, you've done all your audit, you've got your report, how do you keep momentum? So I always encourage people to take action straight away. You don't want that report to end up sitting in a drawer gathering dust and that thing, because business as usual will still be happening and it'll be very easy just to get back into the business as usual. It'll call on you and be quite demanding, but it's really important you make this a priority. If you've spent the money and the time to create this report, you need to take action straight away and get that momentum going. I've mentioned several times about telling the business the next steps. Another reason for doing that is not just communicating with them and thanking them for their time and helping them feel confident that they've been listened to, but it's also holding you accountable. If you tell people you're going to do things by a certain time, then there's much more of a onus on you to actually make sure that happens. So that can be quite a good way as well of detailing the timelines behind some of these actions so that there is a drive for you to make sure you meet them. And you can also book in a follow-up audit so that you know that in a year's time you're going to do it again. So you're going to want those the findings to change. You're going to want to see improvement, and that can only happen by you actually doing some of these recommendations. So that can be a good way to drive that. But I just do want to say as well that obviously measurement shouldn't just be once a year. Measurement should be something that's ongoing all the time, whatever form that might be. So you might do an audit once a year, but there should be ongoing regular measures where you're constantly checking in with the organisation and ensuring you are achieving or on your way to achieving your strategic objectives. That's really important. So I think we're going to move to another poll now.
Yeah, hopefully this one is working. So. Just a second. So I'd love to know, how frequently do you conduct IC audits, provided that you've actually conducted one in the past? Helen really touched upon, it doesn't have to be just once a year. So I'd love to know if people have ever conducted an IC audit more than once a year. So it's interesting to see that 56% of people have conducted an IC audit once a year, whereas nobody has done it for more than once a year. And 44% have actually conducted one once in a few years. So Helen, what do you think? Is this usually the norm with organizations and clients that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you're going to do an audit, it is a big time resource, and you're asking a lot of your employees as well to take part in it. So I think it would be unusual to do them more than once a year. I think once a year is quite a good gauge on that sort of scale. And if you're doing it more than so every couple of years or so, and as long as you've got other measures going on in the meantime, I think it would be worrying if there's no other measurement happening. You want to make sure that there is continual measurement, that you might just do a much bigger check-in once a year or once every other year or so on. But it can be useful to do an audit every year, as I said, because you can then start to see the progress, and it can be supported by the other types of measurements, so engagement surveys, polls, and pulse checks, all those sorts of things, and ideally listening to your organisation frequently, making sure there are ways for employees to share their voice, so you're hearing feedback from the organisation, you're hearing how things are landing, and also I'm big on measuring and also making sure that you're looking at how you can demonstrate how you're impacting the business. So sharing data with other departments and really demonstrating that you are having an impact, and that ROI is really useful as well. So an audit should be an element of your measurement toolbox, not ideally the only thing.
Sounds great. So we have some time for a couple of questions. If any of you have any specific questions, we'd love to, hear some in the chat. I think there is someone who has asked a question. So Mike is asking, what about bespoke audits aligned with major changes, epic change, M&A? So Helen, anything you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, so I've done audits for different purposes. I've done sort of the ones I've talked about here, sort of the full service audits. I've done specific ones for, so I did an intranet audit, which was actually quite a big piece of work, because it was understanding more around the culture. And then I've also been brought in to do audits because there is big change happening, and there needs to be understanding of how that change is landing, or it might be just before the change is about to happen. So it's getting that gauge of the organisation, how internal comms needs to support that change, and ensuring that they're in a really good place, they've got the right channels, they understand their audiences, and they're there to support it. So audits can be really useful for that type of thing that Mike's talking about, to really make sure that you're set up correctly, especially if change is on the way. I mean, change is happening all the time in organisations, but if there is something big like a merger acquisition or transformation, whatever that might be, audits can be a good way of making sure you've got your house in order and you're prepared to support the business in the way it needs to be supported. Sounds great.
And Ali is asking, how do you sell the idea of an audit to the C-suite? So Helen, would you have any advice on, how to convince the executive leadership that we do need an audit?
It can be difficult to sell in, especially if there is a lot of budget involved. I think it's outlined in the benefits. Again, if you have that why, I keep banging on about the why, but it is really important to be clear on why you're doing it, and you can explain that to them. I think it goes beyond that though, before you start trying to sell in the audit, I think we talk a lot about being trusted advisors, and I think that's really key. Having a really strong relationship with your executive team, understanding what's important to them. So being able to have those conversations about what matters to them, what do they want to see from internal comms, and then you can then say, okay, so now we can do an audit to get that baseline and make sure that we are then making sure that we are achieving what you want to see from us, that we're supporting you in the right way. So I think if you can tie it back into what they need to see, what's important to them, always keeping that in mind, that what's in it for them, then I think that you have more chance of selling that in.
Sounds great. Okay, so I think we are done with the questions that we have, which leads us to our resources page. So we have a few resources up on Helen's website as well as on our own. So in case you guys don't know, we have the Guerrilla Games, which is an internal communications competition. So we've partnered with Mike Klein from Changing the Terms to bring this Guerrilla Games competition. So it's essentially an essay competition where you're presented with 5 different situations from internal comms, and you have to apply a creative solution to answer the question or come up with a creative solution to the specific challenge that you choose. And we have some wonderful prizes. We will help fund and bring your idea to life if you win. And then we have some other prizes as well. We have 5 master classes with Dr. Herrero. So it's definitely something super exciting, and it's a chance to flex your creative muscles and really showcase, what internal comms means to you. So I really hope that you guys will enter the competition. We also have some blogs up on Helen's website on how to conduct your internal comms, how to conduct your internal comms audit. So we're going to share some of those resources with you. The CIPR is also doing a study that's going to be released soon. So as soon as we have that study, we're going to share that link with you all as well. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Helen, thank you so much for joining us and for doing this webinar with Contact Monkey.